Thank you, Jean-François. Very kind introduction. So I'm Anne Mottet, I work for IFAD. I was in FAO before. And I have the difficult task to answer the question, what is the sustainability of food and feed, in half an hour. So I apologize already for those who were at some of the presentations during EAP. They're probably going to hear some repetition of what I already said, but I think it's important to mention that after a week of Congress like this, we have a lot of material to discuss today, and I'm sure a lot of you have learned a lot like I did last week. So the way I started preparing a little bit for this topic, I went back to these 4 priority areas for the sustainability of livestock that were proposed originally in 2018 for the Global Forum on Food and Agriculture in Berlin, in order to simplify a little bit the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. So we're looking at food security, nutrition, livelihoods and economic growth, health and animal welfare, and climate, environment, natural resources. So those are, this is some sort of framework that simplifies a little bit the whole topics of sustainability. And I tried to list here what I think could be at stake. So some of the topics, most of them we're going to discuss today. Both for food and feed. So you see, for example, for food security and nutrition, obviously hunger eradication, but also eradication of micronutrient deficiency, and the third form of malnutrition, overconsumption, overweight and obesity, but also inequality, reduce food loss and waste. And when we look at feed, the first topic that we have is food-feed competition for resources, for land, for water and so on. But also the fact that we have different levels of efficiency, so we're going to look into that today. Recycling biomass, feed quality and feed safety, also very important topic. And then when we move to livelihoods and economic growth, the first topic is obviously employment in food systems. And we have different figures. Sometimes for the livestock sector, we say 1.4 billion people. That's not employment, that's actually the number of people whose livelihood is supported, so including children of people working in livestock, for example. Equity and the role of women and young people in particular in livestock system. But also, and we heard this last week at the conference, what is the affordability of a healthy diet? Is it accessible and affordable for everyone? And that is obviously not the case. And something that is more and more important is the food sovereignty aspect. And this is not exactly food security because it has a social and economic component. This is why I put it under livelihoods and economic growth. And when we move to feed, and this is a hot topic, how affordable is feed for livestock producers and how livestock production is affected by volatility of, for example, energy. And that was very strongly the case after the war in Ukraine started. The whole livestock sector saw the impact of the rising cost of energy. Moving on to health and animal welfare, foodborne diseases. Animal products are particularly important for that. They are a strong vector for foodborne diseases. But obviously, again, malnutrition and non-communicable diseases linked to, for example, overconsumption of all sorts of foods. A very important topic, and I think something that is going to give a lot of work to veterinarians and animal scientists in the near future, is the interaction between livestock and wildlife. Not only in extensive systems, for example, when you think about grazing animals interacting with grazing wild ruminants, but also in more backyard system. We all remember the avian influenza and the fact that backyard systems were more exposed to contamination, for example. And the very important topic of antimicrobial resistance. And finally, for the environmental aspect of sustainability, well, the first important topic on the agenda is to reduce the vulnerability and the exposure of food systems to climate risks. Climate is threatening food security, is already impacting and having dire consequences on the number of people suffering from hunger. But also, and we talk about that a lot, reducing greenhouse gas emissions from our diets and in general the use of natural resources. And this is also when the discussion on alternative proteins, and we're going to hear a lot about that today, comes into the picture. When it comes to feed, I think the number one, but that's debatable, we can discuss. The number one aspect is reduce deforestation, because this is very important for climate, for biodiversity, but also for equity, especially for population living in South America, for example. And we're going to discuss also alternative feed. It's not only about alternative protein for food, but also alternative feed. They're very strongly linked. So I'm not going to cover all this, but that's the kind of topics that I had in mind in terms of sustainability. It's quite broad, as you can see. And I'm just going to start with the food security and nutrition aspect. So what is the future demand for food? And this is coming from a prospective analysis done by FAO in 2018 called The Future of Food and Agriculture. And you see, whatever the scenario, business as usual, or more sustainability in terms of consumption, production, and policies, or less sustainability and more stratified societies, what you see is that we're going to need more of all sorts of commodities. And it's not only animal protein, actually. You see that most of the case, in most of the scenarios, we need also more cereals, more fruits and vegetables, and sometimes even more than animal protein. So it's not only about the animal protein demand, it's also about all sorts of food. And this is particularly high. This is a global average. So it includes regions where demand is going to decrease, for example, Northern Europe, and regions where demand is going to increase way stronger than in other regions, for example, Sub-Saharan Africa or South Asia. And the situation in terms of food security is not good. You see here 2 lines, the number of people suffering from hunger and the prevalence. And they both increase, they've been increasing for a few years. You saw that we had a good progress. We had a good trend more or less until 2015. And since then, we're not making any progress. We're actually going backwards. So we have more people hungry and a higher proportion of the human population who is hungry. And this is mostly due to climate change impacts and conflicts. And we still have very strong inequalities in access to food. So you have here a very simple map coming from FAO stat data, where you have, here is the protein supply in terms of grams of protein per person and per day, and how it's broken down between the different sources. So plant protein in green, and then you see the different colors for animal protein. The first thing to see is that there are regions that have twice as much as others, if you compare, for example, North America or Western Europe to East Africa, but also that the breakdown, so what the sources of food from which our protein come from, are very different between those regions. And you see, in particular, the contribution to animal protein being very high in regions, again, like North America, Western Europe, but also Oceania and South America, compared to other regions of the world. Now, going to food loss and waste, we have also very strong differences between different regions. So here I grouped countries, and on the left you have middle and high-income countries, and on the right, low-income countries. And this is the last global estimate I found. The FAO published an estimate in 2013, but there have been revisions since then. And this is from a paper from 2019, as you can see. What you see is that in animal products, we usually have a lower share of production that is lost or wasted, and that's the percentage you have over each of those bars. And the percentage is quite the same between the different types of countries. You see about 21% of meat is lost or wasted in middle and high-income countries, and it's 20% in low-income countries. But what differs is where these food loss and waste are happening. In richer countries, they mostly happen post-farm. That means in the transport or the processing of products, or even the retailing and the consumption side. Whereas in low-income countries, they happen more in production stages. So that means, for example, for livestock, animal diseases that make our livestock less productive, and that's considered a loss. If you have to discard milk, it's a problem for the farmer's income, but it's also a problem for the whole food system, and this is included in there. So different ways to tackle food loss and waste in different regions. That's basically the message. Now I'm going to spend a bit more time on the environmental sustainability I'm not going to be able to cover all the dimensions, but I think on environment there's a lot to say, and it's also a topic that is very, very hot in the public debate and in the scientific debate as well. So this year we propose a new way to look at the sustainability of livestock in terms of environment, and we're looking at 5 big areas that are the bubbles, the gray bubbles here: biodiversity, water, land use, soils, and climate change. And this is a paper that we published this year with Ty Beale, who is a nutritionist from the GAIN Alliance, Global Alliance for Improved Nutrition. If you're not familiar with their work, please have a look, it's very interesting. And we're looking at the sustainability of healthy diets through those different dimensions. And what we argue is that whatever the dimension considered, better circularity, and again a big word, in our food system, especially with livestock has a very strong role to play in circularity, can improve all those positive, those pluses, and reduce those minus that you have on this chart. So just to spend a minute on circularity, what we have at the moment in our livestock systems, they are in a situation that is between linear and circular. So they're not entirely linear. We already recycle a lot of biomass and a lot of manure, but basically we could improve that. So you see on the left the composition of the global feed basket. What does the animal, the global livestock sector consume in terms of feed resources? You see that the large majority, grass and leaves, crop residues already 19%, but we do have grains, 13% of the total dry matter intake. That doesn't seem very big, but it represents about 1/3 of our global grain production. So there is here a large amount of grain that is directed into the livestock sector as feed, and this situation can be improved. We could reduce the feed food competition and improve the use of non-edible products for livestock in their diets. So let's spend a moment on this, because we have to discuss then feed efficiency when we start talking about different feed resources. So when you look at where is the protein we consume coming from, it's about the same amount coming from ruminants and from monogastrics, as you can see, but from different production systems. One interesting fact, the bright red line on ruminants is the protein amount that comes from feedlot system. You see, at global level, it's quite small. Huh? Most of our protein from ruminant come from mixed or grazing systems. On the contrary, for monogastrics, we have a large amount that comes from industrial systems, as you can see, broilers, layers, or industrial pig system. So quite contrasted situations already between ruminants and monogastrics. And we see also more differences in the way they use the feed. So to produce a kilogram of animal protein by ruminants, you need about 133 kilograms of dry matter, while you only need 30 for monogastrics. So you might think they're more efficient. Monogastrics are just more efficient to turn dry matter into protein. But when we look into the detail of this dry matter, you see that we only need 6 kilograms of dry matter that we can eat as human, edible dry matter, from ruminants to produce 1 kilogram of protein, whereas monogastrics do require 16. So the idea here is that ruminants, they turn stuff that we cannot eat into stuff that we can eat, and high quality protein. And we can go even further than that. If you look at the last column, the amount of plant protein that we can eat per the ratio compared to the amount of animal protein produced, you see that for ruminants it's about 0.6. That means ruminants are adding to the amount of protein that we can eat. They do a positive net contribution to protein supply in the world, whereas monogastric, they need 2 to produce 1. I'm not going to go into the details, but you can see that we can further break this down between the different systems, not only ruminants and monogastrics, but also grazing system versus feedlots. And you see the last column here, feedlots are quite inefficient in providing protein compared to what they consume. But this is also true for a smaller backyard system for monogastrics, because they don't use cereals or seed crops, but they use a lot of swill and waste, for example, from the kitchen. So here again, they make a positive contribution. And this translates into the land resource. So you remember one of the priorities for environmental sustainability, because the land used by livestock, the amount of land we need, is directly linked to the feed. So what we see strong differences between ruminants and monogastrics here. Ruminants use large amount of land. You see about 20% of all emerged land. And most of this corresponds to pastures and rangelands and grasslands. The difference between the dark green and the bright, the light green is that the dark one we cannot crop, so we cannot produce something else there. It's non-convertible grasslands and pastures, whereas the 5.2% are, under certain conditions, we could grow some crops there, but we would also lose some other ecosystem services associated with grasslands. And on the other side, you see that monogastric, they are the ones that use most of the arable land, and that's where the efficiency can be improved as well. And you see there are also strong differences between different systems, but most of the land coming from cereals and oilseeds. So this is theoretical. We could improve circularity, we could improve efficiency, but there are actually more and more I would say case studies and actual work in different regions of the world that show how improved feeding systems can translate into protein availability. So this is some work from colleagues in Wageningen, and they looked into some scenarios for what they call low opportunity cost feed. So all the feed that we're talking about, you know, recycling crop residues, byproducts, waste from the agri-food industry, etc. We're not going to go into all their scenario, but basically what they show is that we can produce reasonable amounts of protein. Obviously, in some regions, we will decrease the amount of protein available, especially in North America and Northern Europe. But they would still be at a level that is sufficient for meeting our requirements in terms of protein. However, we need to be very careful because we don't only eat protein, we actually eat iron, calcium, vitamin B12, folate, zinc. And those are just 5 of the most important micronutrients that are actually lacking the most at global level already. So that means we already have strong deficiencies in those nutrients. And when we look at those scenarios, we should always look into the availability of those nutrients. I don't know if you knew, but when I learned that about a third of women in the world lack iron, are actually anemic, I was very surprised. And it's not only in low-income countries, it's also the same figure for the United States, the same figure for Britain. I think it's a bit lower in France, but it's still important. I think it's over 15% of women in France. And this is already the case. We're already lacking diversity in our diets. That doesn't mean we eat enough. We probably eat enough, even probably too much, but not diverse enough. Same thing in China. Another similar study using more of those low opportunity cost feed, LCS here. They saw that you can still increase the amount that is used as animal feed, and that would reduce the amount of irrigation water used for feed production by a third, for example. It could also feed more people, as they found 30 to 185 people more. And they also argued that for this to be feasible, we need appropriate technologies, for example, heating the food waste from the agri-food industry to ensure feed safety, but also regulations to allow this to happen. Okay, so now we close the chapter of feed and we move on to something that is going to be very much discussed today. So I'm not going to be long, but I just want to list those things. Insects for food and feed. So you have a lot of work now that is available, but we still need more, actually. That's my perception anyway. But some experts here will tell us more. We know that the global mass production of edible insects for both food and feed, we have an estimate for that, but at the moment it's mostly still used for feed, and we still talk about the potential for insect as food in many regions. It's already the case. A lot of people in the world already eat insects, but a lot of people don't. I don't know if you ever tried that. There would be a nice poll, actually. How many of you have tried edible insects? Raise your hand. Ah, that's a nice share. Congratulations. I did too. And my perception is that, at least when I read the latest science, is that the impact of mass production at scale for entering the food system at a larger scale for food and feed safety is still to be assessed. So we still have questions to answer from the research side here. Cellular food, we have also way more recognized experts in the room here, Jean-François. So just a couple of thoughts I had about this and listing the 4 areas of sustainability. What about livelihoods and economy? We know that there are large investments happening in cellular food, so that's a strong argument on the economy side, but there's very little relevance of that for smallholder and poor people in the world. So, in terms of equity, who would have access to that? And the cost of this food is still a large problem, I think. In terms of food security nutrition, well, we know that nutritionally there's apparently no big difference with I would say natural meat and now milk apparently, but we still have virtually no market for that and no production at scale. We're still talking about a potential, and this is actually surprising. If you do some research on cellular food and you want to see what's the status, you only see, the potential in 5 years will be, but you have actually very little data on the actual market now because there's virtually no market. On health and welfare, considerably fewer animals needed, so a strong argument, obviously, also in terms of environmental impact, though recent studies show that in terms of electricity need and maybe emissions, we might be even higher than some livestock system because you need to maintain a 37 degrees Celsius temperature all the time. What about plant-based meat and milk substitutes? They're existing market. They've been growing. We know them in Europe, we know them in North America and in many regions of the world. Again, an area where there's been a lot of investments. And the most recent discussions are, as far as I understand, about the level of processing of those products and their actual nutritional value. So some of them, when minimally processed, are perfectly good in terms of health and nutrition. Some others might contain high amounts of salt, for example, and might not be a good idea for consumers. What we see is that the market share seems to have reached some sort of threshold, might even decrease a little bit. We don't know if this is a trend that might continue in the future, but for meat it's been 2 years down, and for milk just 1 year. So let's see where this market might go. And then very quickly, what are the other sources for alternative protein sources? Microalgae. You see here the amount. It's a production that is stabilized. I don't know if the future will see an increase in this industry, but it's been produced. It's not new. You all know spirulina, for example. Mycoproteins, yeast proteins, and precision fermentation, and extraction. And I think there were some discussion during the conference this week on extraction. For example, protein from potato, from green leaves, so a potential here also for the circularity. But some of those alternative protein sources, they're what we call landless. They're not based on soil. For example, if you think about cellular agriculture, you don't need soil. The fact is about 95% of our food is still produced from soils, and it's not only about food. So what I try to propose here is to see, in terms of emissions, let's consider we have a limited budget in CO2. And as consumers and governments, we need to operate within that fixed budget in order to stay under 2 degrees. Where do we want to spend it? So if you compare agriculture and livestock to other sectors, for example, industry or services, what do you get out of a ton of CO2 emitted? When you look at GDP value, obviously you get more value if you spend your CO2 in services and industry. This is the far left on this chart. But when you look at jobs from a ton of CO2, you get twice as many jobs from agriculture than other services. So agriculture is still, at global level, a sector, an economic sector that employs a lot of people. So as a decision maker, that's important. You know, when you have to spend your CO2, do you want to create value? Yes, but you also want to create jobs for people. Obviously, there are differences between groups of countries. This is particularly true for low and middle income countries and less so for high income countries. But then when you look at the food, obviously there's virtually no food coming from services and the industry. It's still coming from agriculture. And you see here in terms of kilocalories, but also protein. And it would be very interesting if the figures were available to move to nutrients. And talking about nutrients, this is, I'm not sure you can read, but this is a very recent paper that looks into the nutrient content of different foods and ranks the different foods based on their emission related to their nutrient content. So you're very used to the left side of the screen, greenhouse gas emission per kilogram of, for example, at the top, beef. Beef is the commodity, the food that emits the more per kilogram. We're very familiar with that. Maybe you didn't know that dark chocolate is second on this list, you know. So you might want to reconsider some aspects of your diet here as well. I didn't know. So this is the ranking that we all know. Important fact though, you see the error bar on this value. So the beef value, for example, 163 in average, you see how much it varies between different systems. So still to take this into account, you have low emitting system and high emitting system, even if the average is very high. But the topic of this chart is to look into what is the ranking if we consider nutrients. And this is if you have in the middle you have kilocalories, that's already changing a little bit the ranking. But what changes the most is greenhouse gas emissions per index of most valued nutrients, and I mentioned them before, iron, zinc, folate, vitamin B12, calcium. And you see that, well, beef is still quite high, but the difference between beef and other food, for example, if you compare it to rice, is not that important anymore. And what you see is that beef liver, comes very, very high because it's very dense in nutrition. So it matters for decisions as consumers or policymakers to have in mind this kind of I would say, new analysis, because otherwise we might base our decision on the left side of the chart only. So the ranking of food, I invite you to look at this paper that's, again, from Tybell and his colleague from the GAIN Alliance. They also looked into land use footprint linked to nutrients, carbon footprint we already saw, freshwater withdrawals based on nutrients, acidification potential and eutrophication. And you see the ranking is quite different. And for example, if you take nuts, they rank consistently as one of the least greenhouse gas emission food, but when you look, for example, at their water footprints, they're quite high. So you need also to consider other dimensions. So talking about dimensions, I think a very strong argument, and this is also for the researchers in the room, is that we need to move away from simple metrics, single metrics. We keep reporting greenhouse gas emissions, for example, but what about water? What about jobs? What about gender? So let's not focus only on one dimension when we make our decisions or when we do our analysis, but let's move on to what we call multi-criteria approaches, and thank you, Alexander, for mentioning it in your introduction, like agroecology. It's an important approach in France and in other countries, and it's an approach that includes not only environment for sustainability issues, but also social dimensions of sustainability. And this is just an example of results from the FAO tool for agroecology performance evaluation. We worked with ISARA on this. Thank you for working with us on this. You see, for example, the comparison of, this is in the Rosario area of Argentina, comparison of a farm specialized in soy production and a more diversified farm with cattle, and how they rank on different dimensions: diversity of production, synergies, efficiency, recycling, and you see that with the presence of animals here, we have higher scores on those different dimensions, including dimensions that are social, for example, responsible governance on the left, or circular and solidarity economy. We did the same analysis in 600 farms in Ethiopia with the same tool, and we see also, though with a different profile, we see that farms with at least one animal did perform better on those different elements of agroecology. And then when we go even further, we looked into 3,000 farms from 9 countries in sub-Saharan Africa, and you see all the results here with the same tool still. And because we talked about recycling and reducing food loss and waste, what do we have here? We see that farms with more diversity of animals, you know, on the right-hand side, usually have higher score of recycling, as measured on the left, recycling of biomass and products and nutrients, water saving, management of seeds and breeds, and renewable energy. Same kind of results if we look at resilience. So it seems that the presence of animals transfer into a higher score of resilience as measured on the left here by the stability of income, the existence of social mechanisms to reduce vulnerability, and so on. So again, you know, in those small livestock mixed farms, the presence of animals and more diversified, for example, 2 or 3 species on the farm, seem to be correlated with higher resilience. And to finish, just a couple of words about IFAD. So I don't know if you're familiar with the International Fund for Agricultural Development. We are an international funding institution under the United Nations. So think of it as a small World Bank dedicated to agricultural development and highly technical financing institution. And you see here, for example, the ongoing IFAD portfolio. We have investments in 231 countries. And the percentage of livestock projects here is 15%. It's been increasing for the past couple of years, but it's bound to increase more. And I don't know if you agree with me, but I find it still quite small compared to, for example, the contribution of livestock to the economy, to the GDP. And what we see is that so far, investment, whether IFAD or World Bank, in livestock have been lower they've been suboptimal, lower compared to what they should be. But this is increasing. And you see it's for a total of about $8 billion. And the areas where we invest in livestock, and this is why I'm mentioning this here, animal husbandry includes feed. So the dark blue is really about feed, and we do a lot of very practical investment in small-scale livestock production to upscale everything that I presented today. So how can we do better recycling? For example, we fund feed choppers for crop residues to be better included in the feed diet. How can we limit food loss and waste? So we also fund, for example, equipment for higher milk hygiene throughout the value chain from producing to processing. We do have a lot of investment in rangeland and pastures and pastoral support services, and I think this is worth mentioning as well. And finally, to show a bit of the impact we measure, I mentioned resilience, but this is, I think, one of the priority area for us, and we are happy to see that in terms of impact, investing, especially in livestock, makes our impact greater than our objectives in terms of resilience, as you can see. So to conclude, and it's not easy to conclude on this topic, and I left a lot of different aspects out of this presentation. But a few thoughts. What does it mean for me, more sustainable food and feed systems? Obviously, eradicating hunger and nutrient deficiency, which requires reducing food loss and waste, which requires improving productivity, especially in low and middle income countries, but also requires better access to markets for small producers. This needs to happen within our strict environmental boundaries, including, and most importantly, climate change and biodiversity, but also land that is used, that is linked to the two other. Better circularity can reduce food feed competition and improve most of those aspects. Single matrix needs to be overcome. We don't want to look at emissions only, but also other environmental and social impacts. And my argument is that approaches like agroecology can help reduce the trade-offs between those different dimensions of sustainability. And finally, this is not going to happen without money. We need to invest, and this is probably for governments more than researchers. You already invest in sustainable food systems, but we need more investment in livestock, and we're starting to see a difference now. But it's a sector that has been, I'd say, until 5 or 10 years ago, a bit overlooked in terms of agricultural investments, and we're changing that. Thank you.